Our epistle reading this morning is taken from the book of Romans, Romans chapter 11 and verses 1 through 2, 29 through 33, and 36. Listen to what the Spirit might speak into your life in this reading from the book of Romans. I ask then, has God rejected God's people, the Jews? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected God's people, whom God foreknew. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that God may be merciful to all. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable God's judgments, how inscrutable God's ways. For from God and to God and through God are all things. To God be glory forever. May God bless to our understanding this reading from God's holy word, and to God's name be glory and praise. Amen. That's nice, isn't it? That little reading tucked away in Romans. I don't often preach from Romans. I don't know if you've noticed that. The Apostle Paul and I had a little falling out some time ago. Our relationship is civil. We still care about each other, but, we had to take a little hiatus. I like Paul's poetic side, but let me tell you, Paul has other sides too. It ain't all 1 Corinthians 13 with Paul. There's other stuff in there. But this is nice. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. How often do you hear that word? Irrevocable. It's great. And then he calls upon the mystery of God. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable God's judgments. How inscrutable God's ways. For from God and to God and through God are all things. To God be glory forever. We'll be revisiting these words in just a moment because they are powerful and beautiful. But I most want to call your attention to the promise that I think probably many of us need to hear today. And it is this: the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, final. They don't get taken away. And why do we need to hear that, you and me? Because so much of what we have gets taken away. I think eventually everything gets taken away. But the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Beauty fades, loved ones pass beyond our reach, health, mobility, memory, all of these things are subject to recall. Life is forever replacing the things we once had with the things we now have, and the people and the places. Sometimes it happens so fast that we don't even notice that it's happening until it's too late. I don't know if you know this, but I used to keep a blog about the Allegheny National Forest back in the days when I lived up there, surrounded by it. Now, you will find lots of blogs about lots of national forests, but the Allegheny, to my knowledge, only had one, and might still only have one, and it was mine. And it does still linger like a virtual ghost on the internet. And people do occasionally still make comments to those old 13-year-old articles. When it was still active, the blog became so popular that an online travel magazine that covers the Pennsylvania wilds began republishing my articles and giving me a little bit of money for them. Thus, my short-lived career as a travel journalist blazed like a straw fire. I had appointed myself the authority on the Allegheny National Forest, and because there were no others, they were like, okay, that's you. But it was fun. I would go out into the woods every week to research an article that I wanted to do about some old abandoned town site or some waterfall that nobody knows about. Or maybe a magnificent rock city. A rock city is a collection of boulders with cliffs and caves. Then I'd come home and I'd write and publish the article, and then people would write in from as far away as Brooklyn and ask questions. How do you get there? Can my golden lab drink from that stream? Now I think I would have to take my own outdated writings back up there if I wanted to go back up, because I would get lost like Hansel and Gretel. It's gone. It's gone. I was the expert, the self-appointed expert. A place I loved and a place I knew, a place that I alone wrote about. It's still there, but it's gone. A sadder story, I had a bachelor uncle that I occasionally talk about from this pulpit. We all called him crazy. I think if he were to get diagnosed today, he probably had some form of Asperger's or something like that. But we didn't know about that back in the 70s and 80s, or at least I didn't. We just thought he was crazy. And we would always cringe and brace ourselves for whatever he might say or do next. He used to mock me mercilessly as a child for using big words and for enunciating too clearly. He said I was trying to talk like somebody on TV. He had 4 nephews and 1 niece, 5 of us. One year he came to Christmas with 1 gift for one of us. It was for my sister, and it was a football. Sometimes he did dangerous things. When I was learning how to swim, he picked me up and threw me into a strip mine pond in the deep end. Later, when I was a student pastor up near Meadville, my greatest fear was that he would show up some Sunday at one of those little country churches and, I don't know, speak in tongues. He died in his 60s from just sitting on the couch. It was all he did. I delivered his eulogy and realized with deep regret that I spent my whole life avoiding this man. My whole life. Seriously. From the time I can remember, I just wanted to get away from him. But who else did he have? My siblings had all moved out of state. Who else did he have? And so I collected up all the old photos of him that nobody wanted, and I appointed myself the keeper of his memory. My kids aren't going to want these photos. If I had it to redo, I would try to be better family to him than I was. But you don't get a redo, do you? Once somebody has passed beyond the veil, you don't get to do it over. Now, in parentheses, I will say, I have learned that you can't beat yourself up over those things. You really just can't. You can only have been who you were. It was the only person you could be at that time. But opportunities don't come back like that. Just one last example, also from my own life, and I will remind you that I tell my own stories in hopes that they will sound an echo in your stories, and also because they're the stories I have. Early in my ministry, I used to use these words from Romans as the closing benediction every Sunday morning. Instead of saying, go into the world knowing compassion and seeking justice, I would quote Paul and I would say, oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable God's judgments, how inscrutable God's ways. For from God and to God and through God are all things. To God be glory forever. It's beautiful, but it's a little verbose. And that's not exactly why I stopped using that benediction. It's poetic and it's comforting, and I got so choked up like a baby when I used it for the last time at one of those little churches I just told you about. But as I was longer in ministry and got to know my people better, I found that I could no longer look into their eyes, knowing what they were dealing with in their lives, and tell them everything in your life comes from God. I couldn't do it anymore. Maybe it does come from God. But I couldn't look at people I cared about and say, everything, not just the joy, but the sorrow, the pain, the broken relationships, the deaths. Maybe it does come from God. I don't know. Maybe there's randomness in the world. Maybe stuff just happens and God is the strength and the beauty that carries us through it. But my ability to speak those words to people's faces, was taken away from me because our ideas change, our beliefs change, our theology changes, and that's hard for a pastor because we're supposed to have all the answers. My theology had changed, and it was being a pastor that changed my theology. So much is taken from us: places, people, ideas, possessions, opportunities, strength, physical ability, memory, a simple absence of pain, hair, respect, status. All of these might get taken from us before the curtain falls. Things change, we change. You and I, we have endured many losses. Much has been taken from us, but the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Irrevocable. Not a word you hear every day, is it? Probably because there are so few things in life that really are irrevocable. Now, we're dealing with the book of Romans here. I had a whole class on Romans, even though I don't preach about it. You cannot just take a little piece of Romans and cut it out and hold it up and understand what Paul is talking about. Romans is a labyrinth. Paul builds his argument painstakingly over many long chapters, waxing memorable and poetic here and there with long stretches of Pauline logic in between. Pauline is the adjective form of the name Paul. And when your name gets an adjective form, you have arrived at your place in history. Nobody is ever going to say Brianian logic. But here Paul is talking about the Jews, of which he is one. He's a Jew. And as the Christian movement makes the painful transition from being a Jewish sect to a Gentile religion, some cocky Gentiles are starting to say, look, we're the new people of God. Forget the Jews. They didn't accept Jesus. We're it now. The covenant that was given to Israel, it's ours. Paul will have none of it. He says, has God rejected God's people? By no means. That's one of his favorite expressions. By no means. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And then he goes on to say that the mercy of God catches up to everybody in time. Jew, Gentile, doesn't matter. And then he concludes the whole matter by calling upon mystery, which I guess is the preacher's cop-out. He calls on mystery and says, oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. You just can't get it. It's too big to wrap your head around. But gifts and callings, they are not taken away. They might change. They might evolve, but they're who you are. They remain. So truly, I've given you a few moments to think about the question, what in your life is irrevocable, final, unremovable, if that's a word? Death, taxes, what else? I mean, you could probably get out from under the mortgage on your house. I'm probably going to have to call those We Buy Ugly Houses people someday. But I could get out from under it if I really needed to. Your student loans, those would be harder to get away from, but you can spend your whole life paying those off. Your wedding vows, those are supposed to be irrevocable. People renege on them every day, and sometimes you should. I mean, if a marriage becomes abusive or neglectful, you should renege on those vows, I guess. If you've ever joined this church, then you made a promise to be a faithful member. And if you're here today or watching online, you're keeping that promise. But you could leave for another church. You could give up on religion altogether. Now here's a harder one. If you have ever been ordained an elder or a deacon, which I think probably most people in this room have, that stain is harder to wash out. There, in order to renege on your ordination vows, you would have to write to the presbytery and renounce jurisdiction. Please don't do it. It would get messy. What is truly irrevocable, irreversible, final in your life, what is? And if a thing is irrevocable, why? It's your love that makes it so, isn't it? It's your commitment, it's your character that makes a thing irrevocable, final, settled, agreed upon. Maybe you feel like you don't have room in your life for your dog anymore. You want to start traveling and the dog keeps you at home. You got to get rid of the dog. Are you going to take it to the pound? No. You're not going to give your dog away. You're the only owner that dog has ever known, possibly. Of course not. Love prevents you from going back on your commitment to care for the living creature that is your dog. Love makes your commitment to your dog irrevocable. You might have an opportunity to secretly violate your wedding vows. Who would know? Whose business is it? Who'd it hurt? But perhaps you'll find that your love makes those vows irrevocable, binding. You can't do it. You could decide that you're tired of your kids. They're too much work. You never got to have a life of your own. It's time for you to finally move out to Idaho and become a potato farmer like you were supposed to do in the first place. Let your mother raise your kids. She did okay with you. Some have done such things, but most cannot, because our commitments to our children are irrevocable. They're more precious to us than our commitments to ourselves. The commitments that are irrevocable to you are all tied up in your love, your character. It's your character that makes you stick by them. You're not the kind of person who abandons a dog or a spouse or a child. You just can't do it, even if you wanted to. You know, it's not because God is duty-bound to God's outdated promise to Abraham that God keeps covenant with the Jews. It's because faithfulness is God's way. That's who God is. That's God's character. And who God is all mixed up with God's love. You know, it's interesting. In the Hebrew language, it takes 3 words to interpret one word, to translate one word, that word being hesed. And it's interpreted in most of our Bibles as steadfast love and faithfulness. 3 concepts all in one: steadfastness, love, and faithfulness. All in one word, hesed. In fact, when the former cantor from Temple Emmanuel came and she sang the 23rd Psalm to us a few months ago, do you remember she did it with such joy? She embodied the words of that psalm. It was kind of like the rendition of Great is Thy Faithfulness that we got last week from Brittany. And interestingly, it was the same concept: God's faithfulness. I said to the Jewish cantor later, after she had sung, after the service was over, you know, Hebrew was my very worst class. They say you can do well in Greek or Hebrew, but not both, and I did like Greek. But the only word I understood when you were singing was hesed. And she said to me the most beautiful thing. She said, that's okay, that's the only word you need to understand. Steadfast love and faithfulness. You and I are faithful to our most cherished commitments because it's who we are. They're all tangled up in our loves and in our character. Faithfulness and love are inseparable. Hesed. So much is taken from us down through the years of this life, but the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. I mean, if you're a caregiver, have you ever known a real caregiver? If that's your gift and your calling, and gifts and callings are usually the same thing, then you will be a caregiver from your wheelchair in the nursing home. You will find a way to worry about other people, to fret over them, to make sure they have what they need. It's who you are. It never gets taken away. If your gift or your calling is art, music, words, you'll always find a way to enjoy, and maybe even to share the beauty of those things, even if your fingers are too stiff to lift a paintbrush or play a note. Truly, our gifts and our callings are always the same, aren't they? Our gifts become our callings. Is it not your lifelong call to use your giftedness in joyful service, to God's world. And the calling that you pursue over the years of your life will be the gift in the end. Not only that you give to the world and to the people you love and the people you don't know, but the gift that you give back to God. What does it all mean? It means that no matter what else is taken from us, and so much is, the gifts and the calling of God remain. Your identity, essentially, your very self, is treasured and remembered and held forever in the life of a faithful God. Nothing good is ever finally lost. The steadfast love and faithfulness of God will not permit it. It's all bound up in the mystery of who God is. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable God's judgments, how inscrutable God's ways. For from God and to God and through God are all things. To God be glory forever. The gifts and the calling of God are yours, now and forever. Amen.